Hello and welcome to a revision screencast on skill acquisition, looking particularly at the types and methods of practice. Now, when you look at the kind of skill acquisition specification linked to practice, it's quite striking on how much you have to do with regard to how many types of practice. So we're looking through 8 types of practice. So with that, we're going to have to be able to give the characteristics of them. So we've got to be able to describe how you practice skills using these practice types. That's the easy stuff, giving an example on top of that. On top of that, we also have to explain the use of. And when you see this word called explaining the uses of, it comes up a lot in the specification. What that means is you have to be able to describe when these practice types are most effective. So when you're choosing, there's certain key factors that will influence which is the most appropriate type of practice to use, and they are ability and classification of skills. So pretty much always, when you have to give describe or compare the use of, or the effectiveness of, or give the advantages of, it will usually be linked to ability levels and classification of skills. So that's just worth keeping in your mind. These two are hugely influential. So what we're going to have a look at there, there's 2 particular types of questions. We're only going to go through the first 4 in red here today. So we're going to have a look at part, whole, part, whole, and progressive part practices. So we'll have a look at a little bit how you integrate these into kind of certain types of questions. So when you get questions on practice, there's 2 particular styles you could get. Style 1 is what I would call a prescriptive question, which pretty much exactly what it says on the tin. It tells you what it wants, and you have to give an example. So this will be an example here. So part, whole, progressive part, and whole part, whole are all methods of practice. Describe each of these 4 methods of practice and movement skills, give an example for each. So that is basically describing each one, giving an example, 4 marks, thank you very much. However, the other types of questions that can come up on practice are a little bit more challenging. So you're looking here, you're thinking, right, it's a question, discuss the use of whole practice compared to part practice when learning skills in sport. Give 1 example of a skill in sport that would be best suited for whole practice and 1 example of skill that would be best suited for part practice. This is the type of question that requires you to have slightly higher order knowledge. It means you need to understand that you have to be able to talk about that when these skills are, these practice types are most effective. So what we'll do, we'll have a look at going through the basic types of question, and then we'll have a look at how you might memorize and apply information to this type of question. So, starting off then, characteristics, uses, and types of methods of practice. We go down here, I'll take you through them one at a time. First up then, we've got whole practice. Now, what you're looking to do, I mean, you will get away with it, but I always think that, examiners are particularly, it's always good to have a word that describes the name of something that's going to be in the question, so it's better not to repeat it. So we start off with whole practice. Whole practice basically refers to the fact you're practicing a skill in its entirety. So for example, a golf swing. Okay, so 1 whole movement through, no breaking down into subroutines. So that's your first one. On top of that, whole part, whole practice. So when you're looking at this one now, so practice a skill in its entirety, now you've got a part. So what happens there is you isolate and practice weak subroutines. Now you could put part, but just so you understand that the kind of skill acquisition term for part is subroutine. And then you put it back into the whole entire skill. So for example here, a tennis serve, a coach or teacher might isolate or identify a weak area, so you then isolate the ball toss as a weak area of the tennis serve as a whole. You practice the ball toss, the subroutine on its own, and then you put it back into the whole skill when you feel like it's perfected. Next type of practice then is part practice. So part practice is this concept of isolating a subroutine from a skill, practicing it, and then putting it back into the skill. So for example, you think, right, my arm action's not very good in a front crawl. I'll work on that separately. I isolate it and then put it back into the front crawl. Following there, part progressive. Now, the key thing here, so far we've had translation words. We've had part equals subroutine, whole equals entirety. And that's allowed us to answer all of these. Now what we get is we have something that it's got an extra word that's not to do with whole or part. So we've got part progressive practice. So when you have part progressive practice, you've got to have an understanding this translates to progressively chaining or chaining. So what you do is you isolate a subroutine or each subroutine separately and then progressively chain them together. So I'll put it there in kind of format there, but if I put it into kind of the triple jump. The triple jump will consist of 4 moves, okay? So part A might be the run up, hop, step, jump. So how it works, you start off, you do the run and the hop and you practice that separately. After that, you put them together. Then you work on the step separately. Then you put the run up, hop and step together, progressive chaining. Finally, you could do the jump and then you put the run up, hop, step jump into together. So that'd be kind of how you work on that. Just cut my thing off there at the bottom. So that would be the run up, hop, step and jump. in one movement. So there are the kind of the key bits there. So they're the kind of the types of questions that I looked at before that said describe each one and give an example of each. That will allow you to do it. Revision wise, just remember that whole should translate to entirety, part should translate into a subroutine, and progressive should translate into chaining. Now your job now is just to make sure that you can put those into kind of sentences and example there. Now I did say to you kind of the type of question, and I'll put here as a hot topic, the type of question you could get is to sort of discuss or compare the use of part and whole practice. You've got to get this idea then that when it talks about the use of, it's when it be used most effectively. So we need to know the advantages and disadvantages. So have a look first of all then, whole practice. So whole practice, doing a skill in its entirety, is most effective for, or because, or effective for in this case, high organisation skills. Because as you'll remember from the classification of skills screencast, high organisation skills can't be broken down into subroutine. A golf swing cannot be broken down into subroutines. So these skills are absolutely vital to be taught as a whole because you can't break them down into anything. So they're very effective for them. On top of that, practice skill as a whole helps you develop fluency as well as kinesthesis. So it allows you to get flow of a skill. Okay, you're not breaking it down, chunking it, and getting kind of a limited fluency. It also gives you the feeling, the true feeling of the movement you're doing, and it's really a vital part of this. On top of this, whole practice is also massively, most effective. Well, it's the most effective type of practice, full stop, but particularly for high ability performers or autonomous performers, because they understand the requirements of the skill, so they can do it as a whole. They don't need to separate the subroutines. Okay, and that's a good important point there. On top of that, the key thing to whole practice is it's the most effective practice of the lot because it's the most realistic practice. When you're taking part in a sport, that's what you do. You do the skill as a whole, so it's the most realistic type of practice. On top of that, it's the least time-consuming type of practice because you're not isolating any subroutines, you're not chaining them together, and also, if you want to add an extra bit on here, not only is it the least time-consuming, it also allows you to improve or perfect the timing elements of a skill, so you can have a double time there for your answer. On top of that, so that gives you an overview then of why whole practice is so important. And on top of that, we then need to have a look at, right, okay, so what is it? And once you know this, of course, you can start to use some of these and cross them over because part is the polar opposite practice. So what we have to do now is make sure that we understand this concept that part practice then is effective for low organisation skills because they are the skills that can be broken down into subroutines. Okay, so you can chunk them up and break it down. On top of that, it's really effective for serial skills, okay, which have several discrete elements joined together. But certainly in terms of an exam and the type of questions you're going to get, this would be enough. Low organisation, because you can break them down into subroutines. So you do use part practice for these types of skills. On top of that, low ability. It's most effective for low ability performers because when you break down the subroutines, success in the subroutines is more achievable. So, for example, you think, right, somebody's trying to do a triple jump, they've got no idea, but you put it down into the run-up and the hop, and they practice that, they get success. Now, this increases their confidence, okay? So, having success in the subroutines will increase confidence. I mean, if you want to add an extra one in here, just to extend your knowledge, it's also very good for complex skills, because when the decision-making is really high, sometimes the whole practice can be too much, okay? So, therefore, you can break it down. It can actually help with those complex skills. So, that will give you an example of how you would answer this. It could ask you for stuff to add on top of that, e.g. an example. So you have to make sure when it says to compare the use of, you can give 2 advantages. It'd be very rare that you'd have to give more than that, 3 maybe max in terms of your advantages for those. And of course, if you were asked, which is unlikely with this command word, the disadvantages, you could be then linking it to, obviously, if these are advantages for this, the disadvantages for whole practice is not very good for this, and it's not very good for this. So you just flip over the advantages of one to become the disadvantages of the other type of practice. So let's have a look then. In terms of how we remember this, I've got this. I've had a lot of problems student kind of memorising this stuff. So what we'll do is we'll say, right, whole and part. When you see whole and part come up, compare the use of whole and part. You say in your mind, oh, fart. Whole and part, oh, fart. And one reason why you do that is because the OH comes at the top here. And it's talking about organisation or high organisation skills. So the OH, organisation high, put that to there. It's good for high organisation skills. Fart. F, it's good for developing fluency, okay? A, ability, okay? So it's good for high ability performance for whole practice. Then you've got R, is the most realistic or the best type of practice, and finally it's the least time consuming and the most effective for developing timing. Now when you look at this, you're thinking, right, oh well, hang on, that's just telling us the advantages for whole, but of course you can hook these memory points, because if whole practice is most effective for HO, high organisation, part practice is most effective for low organisation skill. If you go down to here, if whole practice is most effective for high ability performers, part practice is most effective for low ability performers because they get confidence in it. And that gives you, by remembering this one acronym, okay, or memory method, I would say, this allows you to build up and break out and kind of extend your knowledge into a kind of a 5-6 mark question. So if we have a look then, let's see if we can apply this into the exam question. So if you want to pause now, just make sure you've got that memory method. See if we can apply it to an exam question. So type of exam question you'll be looking at. So let's see what you can remember with regard to the memory method first. So if you started off here then, discuss, compare the use of whole and part practice. If I put on here now, whole and part, old fart, can you have a go at remembering what they mean, first of all? Okay, so that might help you now. Do you think, pause it, see how much you can remember and apply. Can you give 2 advantages of whole, 2 advantages of part? Okay, there you go. So that will give you advantages for whole. How about part? Okay, so see how you've gone with that. And now the final thing which I'll give you is, if I said to you on here, discuss the use of whole practice compared to part practice when learning skills in sport, give one example of a skill in sport. I'll let you read it. So this is now your final application. If you pause the screencast now, can you first of all see whole, part, whole and part? Can you remember the memory method? Can you write that down here? And then can you translate it into answers that you think will give you 6 marks? Remember, this asks for a skill in a sport that could be used for each of these types of practices. So have a go at it and see how you go. Okay, so answer that will come up for this then. Obviously your memory method, so whole and part, whole fart. From there then, can you try and move that into an answer? So you should have, as we've done before, exactly the same. I haven't got the mark scheme here, but I can assure you I've got this from the mark scheme and tried to make it into a way you can remember. So whole and practice then, effective for higher organisation skills, good because it develops fluency, it's good for higher ability performance because they understand the requirements of the skill, most realistic, blah, blah, blah. And the example of a skill that you could use for this would be a golf swing. Okay, and then if you're comparing it to part practice, effective for low organisation skills, good for low ability performers, as successive subroutines can increase confidence. For example, arm action in front crawl. So that's kind of me just putting it into answers. You could put that into your own kind of writing, give it a bit more context maybe, but ultimately they are the key areas that are required for whole and part. So if we just go back to your kind of start point, I said to you, you need to be able to do this. 1, 2. Can you do the basic prescription question? Can you use the evaluation skills that allow you to give the most effective uses of each type of practice? Okay, hopefully you feel okay with that. We'll have a look at the other practice types in your next revision screencast.